Good evening, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Katan. I'm the director of the Alliance program. The Alliance, as many of you will know, is a partnership between Columbia University, Sciences Po, Paris Sorbonne, and École Polytechnique. We work very closely with faculty and students to promote and develop academic collaboration among the 4 partner institutions, and we do that through joint degrees, through joint research projects, visiting professorships, and doctoral mobility. I'm absolutely thrilled to be partnering tonight with Maison Française, Shami, Pierre, and her team, who very kindly are hosting us tonight. We're also partnering for this event with Columbia University Press, and I think Wendy Lochner, representing CUP, is here with us tonight. The Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, headed by Bernard Harcourt, is also one of our co-sponsors, as well as the European Institute and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. Tonight's event focuses on a very controversial question: should we tolerate the intolerant? In today's polarized political landscape, the idea of tolerance seems to be on the back foot, with increasingly violent debates on migration, hate speech, impeachment, religious symbols in public spaces, distrust between politicians and the public, and between political parties. What is the role of tolerance? And what are the limits to tolerance? What should be done when extremist voices threaten the very order upon which tolerance is based? So to debate these issues and to help clarify some of these questions, we have a very high-powered panel of thinkers with us tonight. Denis LACORNE is a research professor at Sciences Po, Paris, with the CERI, the Centre d'études et de recherche internationale. His books in English includes a number of publications: The Limits of Tolerance, Enlightenment, Values, and Religious Fanaticism, published by CUP. Religion in America, Political History, as well as Language, Nation, and State Identity Politics in a Multilingual Age. Denis LACORNE also co-edited with Amandine Barre a book on blasphemy, La Politique du Blasphème. He is publishing this week an empirical study on French startups in the United States entitled Tous milliardaires, le rêve français de la Silicon Valley. Bernard Harcourt is the Isidore and Seville Baker Professor of Laws, Professor of Political Science, the Executive Director of the Eric Holder Initiative on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Founding Director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. Bernard has authored several books, including The Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens, and Exposed Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age. He is the editor of many books by Michel Foucault, and he's also the directeur d'études at the École d'études en sciences sociales in Paris. Bernard represented death row inmates in Montgomery, Alabama, at what is now the Equal Justice Initiative, and continues to do so today. And finally, our moderator, SHERI BERMAN, is a professor of political science at Barnard College. Her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She has written about these topics for a wide variety of scholarly and non-scholarly publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. SHERI currently serves on the boards of the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science Quarterly. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship, From the Ancient Regime to the Present Day, came out earlier this year. And one last thing, I would just ask you to turn off your mobile phone, or at least to turn them on silent, if you don't mind. And then books by Bernard Harcourt and Denis LACORNE will be on sale just outside after the event. Please join me in welcoming our panel tonight.
just wanted to thank you for the invitation, and for me, it's wonderful to be back here. It's been quite a while that I've been back in New York, over 10 years. I should put to admit, I spend more time in California these days than the East Coast. And I was lucky to come years ago at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, which had just been created at the time, and I was one of the first 2 or 3 fellows when I came here, and that's where I started to think about religion in the United States and also the question of tolerance. So it's wonderful to be here, back.
Great. So I thought we would start with some questions for Denis, based largely on this wonderful new book, which I have to say, as a non-political theorist, I found fascinating. I strongly recommend it. It is also remarkably lucid on a topic that is incredibly complicated and difficult, and so it's a great read. So let's just start off by jumping into some of the questions or issues that the book raises. So you note to me in the book that toleration is a very complicated and even ambiguous concept, and its meaning and implementation have changed over time and been influenced by the particular historical context within which it has evolved. I wondered, therefore, if you could begin by explaining for us a basic distinction that you lay out in the book that I think is incredibly important, both historically and also in thinking about some of the controversies that we have today, namely a distinction between what is sometimes referred to as negative versus positive toleration, or sometimes older versus newer forms of toleration.
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. Now, why did I become interested in the topic? I had written a book on religion in the United States, and I wanted to expand my horizon to look at the question in a comparative context with a much longer historical perspective. And I became interested in tolerance at a time when we in Europe had the impression that there was no need to speak about religious tolerance. It was a non-issue. Religious tolerance in the 80s and 90s was solved, basically. Why should we care about it? Whereas tolerance raised important issues when what was at stake was gender and diversity. But that wasn't my concern. My concern was religion, and why so little has been written in French about tolerance. And then what happened? When I started to reflect on the topic, there was the Rushdie affair, 1989, which was a sudden rise of religious intolerance as not seen for quite a while. Then there was 9/11, of course, in the United States. And later in France, in 2015, the Charlie Hebdo's massacre, 12 journalists were murdered at the site of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And 2 days later, a Jewish kosher supermarket was also attacked with 4 people died, I think. And then there was the Bataclan massacre in same year in December. So suddenly the topic, what appeared to be a non-issue, became a crucial issue. And the key question is why religious intolerance challenges the idea that, wrongly, the idea that we had become tolerant. And tolerance, intolerance have to be seen, if you take a very long historical perspective, as a cyclical phenomenon. And here it's very important to draw the distinction, which you raised, between a negative concept of tolerance and a more positive or more modern concept of tolerance. And often one is confused with the other, so it's important to make a distinction. Central point of the book is that you have a negative conception of tolerance, which emerged after a number of very brutal religious wars. The Saint Bartholomew massacre, about 10,000 deaths in France, 30 Years' War, 6 million deaths or so. And so tolerance at first was discussed to try to solve those murderous years and to come up with a definition which was negative in the sense that tolerance had to be accepted, but with reluctance, pain, as kind of a burden that was better than the alternative being continuous warfare in Europe. So that's one meaning of the term, which lasts quite a long time. And I take the example, for instance, of the Edict of Nantes, which attempted to reconcile Catholics and Protestants in France in 1595. But what's interesting is, even though it's an old thing, documents, the language is quite modern. Here's a quote from Edict of Nantes, Article 2. It was decided in reconciling Huguenots and Catholics that, quote, insult, attack, dispute that provoked one member of the religion for what happened in the past, quote, all should live in peace like brothers, friends, and citizens. So it's a bold statement. But the achievement was limited in the sense that at the time tolerance was fine for Protestant minority, but it was tolerance in a regime of intolerance. The dominant regime, the monarchy, was Catholic, and the hope was that sooner or later the Protestants would give up their religion and turn back to the Catholic Church. And in fact, they were never labeled as an authentic religion. They were labeled as the so-called Protestant religion. So let me define then the other type very briefly, and I'll stop with that for the moment. Positive notion of tolerance. What do I mean by that? It takes a long time to develop, a couple of centuries, and the help of great philosophers is there. Philosophers of Clark, like Voltaire, but also perhaps Montesquieu or Jean Baudin and so on. And here, by positive tolerance, what do I mean? I mean the open acceptance of diverse religious communities, none of which can be viewed as superior or inferior to another. They all possess rights or imply the existence of rights. And in such a context, if you wish, dissenters, members of minority religion, are to be respected even though their beliefs do not have to be accepted as they are. And this would be called, referred to a German philosopher, Forst. That could be called the kind of respect conception of tolerance. That's the second meaning that I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm. And you also point out, though, that a critical difference was that in the earlier form of tolerance was dependent on the approval or sanction of a sovereign, right? But rather, this later concept is something that's seen as sort of inherent in individuals. And you quote that great letter by George Washington to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, right? It says, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike of conscious and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. In other words, these were natural rights. These were not rights that were dependent on, again, being indulged by another group, a sovereign, etc. And so the nature of toleration switches because it's no longer supposed to be dependent on, again, an external power or an external force.
Yeah, it no longer depends on the will of the sovereign. And it's, I think, basically linked to as a question of rights, citizenship. The minute you're a citizen, then you're no longer a Jew or someone who may be tolerated but not for long. And Washington has the same intuition as Mirabeau or as Tom Paine or Abou Saint-Etienne. They all say that tolerance, but if tolerance, the old meaning of the term no longer applies. We're at the end of the 18th century, that no longer applies. Now we have constitutional rights. It could be a utopian, and those rights are not really truly enforced, but they exist there. The basis is there, and from those rights, we're building a new type of tolerance, which I call respect instead of tolerance.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's move on then a little bit to a topic that's related to that you sort of also mentioned right at the beginning when you were talking about some of these kind of formative experiences. So the subtitle of the book, of this book, is Enlightenment Values and Religious Fanaticism. And for, probably for most of us, those two things seem to be at sort of opposite ends of the political spectrum. But in fact, as you already kind of indicated, religious fanaticism and more generally the need to deal with religious diversity is central to the development of toleration in the West in particular. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more sort of about how that played out, how the need in particular to deal with these conflicts that came from religious diversity and societies that were religiously diverse played a crucial role in kind of propelling the development of thinking about and policies to implement toleration forward.
Yeah, in response to that, I think what's key is to take a very long historical perspective. Because today, when you talk about fanaticism, we make too easily not the analogy, but we say fanaticism, that's Middle East, that's ISIS or Daesh, those are examples of fanaticism, and end of the discussion. And that's a very modern, recent understanding of what is fanaticism all about. What's fascinating, if you place yourself in the 17th, 18th century, is the locus of fanaticism is not the East, is not the Middle East, is Europe. The fanatics are themselves. That's what Locke and Voltaire keep telling us. Fanaticism, it's a European phenomenon. And what's interesting in that, and they give numerous examples, Central in the New, the 30 Years' War, and so on. And what's interesting is that they also say, if you look at counterexample of moderation, you have to travel elsewhere. You have to travel to the east. You have to go into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. That's where you find possibly a form of toleration. And I could give two examples. For instance, Locke in the letter of toleration, the letter concerning toleration, has this passage where he imagines a conflict between Calvinists and Armenians, not Armenians, but Armenians do not believe in Palestinian remonstrance, if you want to be in the Dutch context. And he says, I quote Locke, here you have, he takes himself to the position of a Turk in Constantinople, looking at a strange conflict between Calvinists and Armenians, and in fact laughing at what human cruelty Christians rage against Christians. And then take Voltaire. Voltaire is not known for his pro-Semitic sympathies. Nonetheless, imagine himself as a rabbi, Rabbi Akid, who praises the Turks for tolerating a whole variety of Christian churches in the Ottoman Empire, as well as cite Rabbi Akid, invented by Voltaire, as well as ourselves, the humble servants of Moses. So it's a very important trope. Intolerance is really in Europe, and we want to come out of it. So we need models of tolerance, maybe primitive forms of tolerance, and those different philosophers often find it in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, what they have in mind is the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so now let's deal with the title of the book, right? So the title of the book is The Limits of Toleration, right? And so, as with all political concepts and values, toleration is neither clear-cut nor absolute, right? And this is illustrated, I think, nicely in the book by a quote from Karl Popper, which is referred to as Popper's paradox, right? And I think probably we're all familiar with this in this audience, right? Americans in particular. Okay, so here's the paradox, right, of toleration. What happens if certain individuals refuse the very principle of open, mutual, reciprocal tolerance? What happens if, within our society, certain groups, parties, churches, minorities repudiate tolerance and advocate violence to impose their ideas? Shall we or shall we not tolerate these minorities, asks Popper. If we do not tolerate them, we seem to deny our own principles. We seem to make concessions to intolerance and so become hypocrites. If we do tolerate them, we may become responsible for ending democracy and toleration. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this with reference perhaps to some particular cases where this tension or this potential conflict came into being. And Bernard, I thought maybe if you want to come in on some of on this as well, and we can continue from there, because this is really, again, I think where a lot of contemporary debates and issues are really kind of, you know, sort of rotating around.
Yeah, so Popper, the paradox of tolerance. You know, what if the tolerant regime or the tolerant person faces a wall of intolerance? How do we solve the problem? And Popper, in the quote that he uses, is not terribly explicit on what should we do. And since I found another text from Popper in an earlier book that he wrote in 45, if I'm not mistaken, and there it says, well, how to deal with the intolerant. And here's what it says. If the intolerant refuses all rational argument, and let me cite Popper specifically here, and teach their followers to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols, end quote, then they should be eliminated. The intolerant cannot be tolerated. And of course, what he had in mind, I mean, he came from Vienna, he observed the rise of Nazism in both Germany and Austria and Vienna. And so for him, apparently the trick, what really led him to write those different passages is when the Nazis went to power, and Goering at one point said, well, we have to eliminate our enemies, meaning physically, and we may kill some innocent people, but that doesn't matter. That's what you have to do when you're tough. And he was so shocked by the statement by Goering that he then developed his reflection on how do we be tolerant, deal with intolerance. And there are several ways of looking at borderlines. You know, at which point should we tolerate or not tolerate? At which point is the intolerance tolerable or not? And what I propose to do, but we could decide, you know, which of the different topics I could deal with. This blasphemy is a good case in point, where you look at the limits of tolerance. Satire is another one, and one may overlap with the first. A third example would be the prohibition of religious symbols in the public square, with quite surprising, striking differences between the United States and Europe, France particularly. And then another case, which has been studied a lot by American lawyers, actually, is the question of fighting words, or rather true threats. What happened when you have true threats, as in the case of Charlottesville's riots in 2017. What should be tolerated, the kind of event that led to Charlottesville? Those are the things that I could mention. But,
So I want to push you on this though, right? Because I think everybody can agree that when a group advocates violence, actual physical violence, that is a legitimate red line. But the problem is, as your book points out, is that that's the easy case, right? The other cases you brought out, blasphemy, satire. What about claims increasingly by some, oddly enough, on the left, that speech is actually a form of violence, that it hurts me, and so therefore it should be stopped. How do we make those distinctions, right? You have a lot of really very difficult cases in this book, and I'm trying to goad you to come in on this, right? And there are very different lines that are drawn on different sides of the Atlantic, and you both are incredibly well positioned to discuss this, since you know both European and American cases extremely well, right? How are those distinctions made on different sides of the Atlantic? And in your opinion, what is the right way to consider these kinds of cases? Again, direct violence, I think everybody kind of agrees, that's outside the sphere. But what about these things that are not actual physical violence, but that individuals or groups feel are so intimidating or so problematic or so injurious of their individual or collective rights that we cannot tolerate them any further? Again, but not physical violence. Where are those lines drawn on the two sides of the Atlantic, and where should they be drawn in your views?
Just go ahead.
So, well, I mean, I think you're right, Sherry, that the line of violence is very attractive, but always ends up being a little bit too simplistic. I mean, it's too easy to limit free speech, to just talk about free speech in this country, for instance, and to limit it at something of an incitement to violence. And so that raises a very complicated question as to how else to think about it. One of the things that I find so attractive about your book, Denis, is that you are very self-reflective and very open to exploring these questions of tolerance in your own context, or in France, for instance, on the burkini, for instance, where you are pretty clear in the book that you think that it was a form of intolerance to prohibit the burkini. And also very clear on the way in which these questions are embedded in cultural and historical contexts that are unique to each location, which explains the different histories and the different ways in which we need to treat these matters. I mean, the position I take is that actually the idea of free speech, or the idea of total tolerance, can be very attractive, but is actually it's actually misleading in the sense that there really never is anything that is free in speech, and there's never really anything that is free in terms of these questions of toleration. In other words, there's never anything that's not really regulated through various forms of mechanisms of regulation that we often just don't see, and that we're willing to ignore because they're complicated. But that in fact, for instance, on a campus like Columbia, right, there isn't anything like free speech. It's not free. Usually there's always some attachments. There are always attachments to it. It's funded maybe by an organization that receives money maybe by a university or from another organization. It costs money to bring in speakers, etc. And all of that is regulated, where you get space to have your speech, etc. And so I think that ultimately all of these things are regulated in different ways that we tend not to see, and that it's those regulatory forms that we would need to discuss and tinker with if we really wanted to get at
But usually what criteria, right? Yes, of course, everything is regulated on a college campus and elsewhere, right? But you're at a law school, you have to have rules. There have to be some objective criteria by which you make judgments about what should and should not be regulated. So the question is, different rules on different sides of the Atlantic, but also from a, I don't know, normative perspective perhaps, what do you think are the right criteria that should be used maybe on college campuses, but just maybe more generally to decide, okay, look, I think these cartoons are offensive and injurious to me. I don't like that speech because it's injurious to my group and takes advantage of my disadvantage. What criteria do we use to decide what should and should not be tolerated once we separate ourselves from that bright line of violence?
Well, I can give you my answer.
Yeah.
We can
Yes.
give you answer. It would be a very careful attention to relations of power historically and forms of oppression historically, and in some way trying to address those so as to reduce the legacies of oppression over time in relations of power. That would be my
So toleration is not absolute, it's subverted or subordinated to the rectifying of historical wrongs.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
So it has no absolute value or
For sure.
value at all.
No. It's actually toleration or tolerance, because there's a difference between toleration and tolerance. Tolerance is kind of like this positive idea of tolerance. is a rhetorical device that's used predominantly in struggles and questions of exploitation.
So I'm curious what you think, because your book paints a very different picture, right? The toleration has historically been something that's benefited minorities and the weak, in fact, not something that has been used to exploit or oppress them. And so I wonder if you agree with Bernard's view about how we should think about tolerance and apply it in some contemporary settings.
No, I think tolerance has a real impact based on not just forces. I mean, there are forces, economic forces, relations of production and so on that can have an impact, but one should never neglect the what we call the ideology, or the role of state ideology and the role of what Marxists used to call the superstructure, which, by the way, is rejected today by economists. For instance, Piketty, in his new book on capital and ideology, moves away from the old Marxist perspective and saying that we've and his books about inequality, how to resolve, limit the problem of inequality. And Piketty tells us in his new book, we economists have been too focused on latent forces, economic forces and so on. They carry some weight, but we've underestimated the importance of state structures, state government, constitutional affairs, the rule of courts. And if you play this card on courts, the law, and so on, you can really change things. I think the same is true about tolerance. Of course, the answers are not always fully satisfactory. Take and that's the point that Bernard made, is never such a thing as free tolerance or free expression. And that's true. In France, the so-called Loi sur la liberté de la presse, the law on press freedom of 1877, in fact, is a law on freedom of expression, despite the name. And that law has been revised many, many times. And what's fascinating is to understand why the revisions of the law. And what's interesting in that law, there was first a part of the law that sanctioned anti-Semitism or hate speech that would target Jews, and why the law was amended, well, because of what happened under Vichy France. So that was and then later in 1972, so-called Plevin law, which was integrated in part of the French freedom of expression law, determined the following. There was a kind of refinement on the understanding of what hate speech is or is not, and the revised law said the following. It said that if you target, if you provoke, discriminate, use defamation against, or insult a person or a group of persons because they belong to a particular religion, a particular gender, or a particular race or national identity, but the key here is religion, then that can be sanctioned. That's not permitted. So there are restrictions to the law of free expression in France. But the restriction, that's the way the courts have functioned in using that law, maybe wrongly using the law, but using that law. But, okay, you cannot have hate speech against a group. However, you can have hate speech, you can say whatever you want, including the most insulting thing, if it's a belief, not other groups. So there's a distinction between believers, you cannot insult them, defend them. But beliefs, religious symbols, whatever their nature, it's fine. It's free. You can say whatever you want to mock them. And to illustrate that, let me give you one example, which is striking because the author is quite popular in the United States, thinking of Welbeck. Now, Welbeck said, let me try to be accurate here. He said once in an interview for the journal Lear, Islam is c'est la religion des cons, religion de cons, which is a religion for for assaults, basically. It's very strong.
Forces.
Yeah. I think so, yeah. And of course, people went to court, tried to get him condemned for violation of the law of freedom of expression, and he, in that case, he won. So a number of people were surprised and said, well, yes, he was attacking Islam. He was not attacking Muslims or North Africans as a group. Had he written tous les musulmans sont des cons, all Muslims are assholes, then he would have lost his file and be condemned. So it's a strange distinction, but which has become key in the French legal establishment, the distinction between beliefs and believers.
Right. So where I think we have we agree is that I think the discourse. So the question is whether the discourse of tolerance, like the discourse of civility today, oftentimes, right? A discourse in which we speak about tolerance or civility in our behaviors, whether that discourse, in fact, is a rhetorical device that has implications in particular contexts in terms of how power is distributed in society, essentially. And I get a sense that, I mean, Sherry, you're trying to, I think you're drawing on the more historical parts of the book, of Denis' book. You want to suggest that there's a valorization of tolerance that is maybe in tension or, maybe slightly in tension with the contemporary analysis, say, of how tolerance plays out in the case of the burkini or in the case of free speech or something like that. Because it feels as if when we look at it historically, we value it, it's the Enlightenment values. Most people think favorably of the Enlightenment values. I don't, but most people do. So I mean, usually it's a positive. It speaks of Enlightenment values in a positive sense.
If they lead to specific rights, I mean, Enlightenment values without guaranteed rights don't carry much weight. So there has to be a moment when those rights are defended, and that is to say, citizenship, equality, respect.
But I take it that the history that you provide here is a positive history. It is a
positive
positive history of tolerance.
Yes and no, there are regression. I mean, if you look at the French case, there is what I call a repressive spiral. If you look at the French government attitudes toward the Islamic veil, whether it's the hijab in school or the burqa in the public space, the public square, or the burkini, then there is a repressive spiral which has to do with fear of Islam and the strange obsession. It really has become an obsession in France, which is in itself hard to explain. I mean, the latest being, for instance, there's a whole debate in the French press about whether some women who wear the veil can accompany young students in school outings. And the government position is, well, yes, no, and there are huge debates between different factions. And the very fact that we have those debates is disturbing, I would think. This repressive spiral leads to two things. The idea that, in fact, we tolerate, but it's a regression in the sense of tolerance. We tolerate Muslims as long as they are invisible in our space. If they're not visible in public space, that's fine. If they are visible, there's a problem, which is a strange way to indeed try to solve tensions in society. And then there's another phenomenon that takes place, which is the state obsession, not just state, but also courts, French courts, but also European Court of Human Rights, that if you don't satisfy a certain norm called le vivre ensemble, which is a kind of vague ideology, but it has legal consequences. If you don't respect the divorce, if you wear a burqa or some kind of veil, then you don't belong to the society, and you should conform to this new norm that we call living together, the divorce. And that's something that I would question.
Right. But right there, right? It's the whole discourse about tolerance and intolerance to intolerance, intolerance to the burqa because it's a form of intolerance in itself, right? So it's that whole kind of conversation that ends up then distributing rights and duties and power in society as to whether or not someone can, in fact, whether or not Muslims are allowed to express themselves or not in public through their through what they wear, etc. So I mean, where I think we agree, although we might be saying this differently, in response to your question, Chair, is that it is this entire way in which we approach these issues by speaking about the need for tolerance, but only up to a certain limit, and ourselves being relatively intolerant of intolerance, etc. The way that we speak about it, that ends up engaging in politics, engaging in turning a country returning a country more to its, in France, its Christian roots, or laïcité, or a more secular country, or one that, I think all of those are going to have kind of material implications, of course, for different segments of society. So it's going to be essentially distributing rights and duties and material wealth and possibilities through a discourse about tolerance of intolerance, etc. Right?
So I think we definitely want to make sure we have time for questions, but I just want to, again, clarify a couple of points here. So first of all, obviously there's very different approaches taken to this on different sides of the Atlantic, right? Controversies that you have in France about certain kinds of dress, for instance, are non-issues here, right? So, but the point that you make, right, which is one of the justifications that's given for banning certain types of religious symbols or religious clothing in the public sphere, right, is that that is an affront on some level against tolerance, right? It is indicating, again, some kind of behavior that is offensive to the idea of tolerance. Now, so then the question becomes, right, where is that line drawn, right? Because nobody's trying to legislate against what you wear in your own house. The question is what you wear in government offices or more broadly in the public sphere, right? And again, very different on different sides of the Atlantic, right? So interpretations of what is of where the line for intolerant behavior is drawn very different in France, for instance, than in the United States, right? And so presumably, you know, one could discuss which is more appropriate or accurate, or alternatively, which is more consistent with that particular country's history.
But I think Denis' point, you'll tell me, is that those are historical artifacts. They're kind of contingent in a way. They're contingent, and so, for instance, the intolerance towards Nazi speech in France or in Germany today is a historical artifact of the Nazi regime in Europe at mid-century, whereas in the United States, the intolerance today, say, of Confederate memorials, so statues, is an artifact of our history in this country. And that, I mean, I take it the point is, I'm not sure.
But presumably the hypersensitivity to expressions of religion in the public sphere is a totally legitimate reflection of the pernicious anti-liberal, anti-democratic role of the church in France. Yeah? I mean, that's where those rules and norms come from.
Well, there's, if you give a tremendous space and power to the church, but the church, the Catholic Church essentially in France, doesn't have that power anymore. And I think, first of all, rival churches and Islam is pretty big in the French space, so it's not the dominant norm anymore. Hence the confusion. I mean, you have different rules, what's allowed in the public space, what's not allowed, and they keep changing. There's nothing rigid about it. And norms of behavior also are changing all the time, and whether you can eat certain food or not, that's related to different religions. So it's not so much a problem. The problem is how do we regulate the public space in imposing norms or not, and things are in fluctuation, I would say, for instance. There's openness to a whole variety of experience, whether they're religious or not. Tolerance is mixed with intolerance. I mean, you have clashes, but there's not much religious tolerance, religious violence today in France. That used to be the case. I don't think it's the case today. And maybe it's indifference, which is the rising value.
No, but I thought one of the main points of your book was that these different conceptions of tolerance grow out of particular historical experiences. So we're more sensitive to Confederate monuments in Germany. One understands why there's a more strict prohibition against Nazi speech. But given French experience with, again, the Catholic Church, right, a sort of dislike of expressions of religiosity in the public sphere is a legacy of that conflict, admittedly a legacy of it, right? It's no longer a live conflict, but that has shaped understandings of what is and is not acceptable. But okay, let's make sure that other folks get a chance to ask questions because it's obviously important to have a conversation more broadly. So would anyone like to start off with some questions for our panelists? Yes.
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. As listening to the conversation, it's obviously it's a very complex subject to get lost. I would think that tolerance or toleration remains, whether it's modern or ancient or positive or negative, remains, is still dependent on the majority and minority, a strong and a weak. And so tolerance is always going to be something that's granted by a strong to a weak. And so, I mean, let me take an example. I think, if you live in a Muslim country, and I was born in Tunisia, I'm not taking the example of Saudi Arabia, talking about very sort of liberal and open Muslim country, Tunisia. As the Jewish community in Tunisia always, even though we were treated quite well altogether over time, but we knew how to keep our place because we're still a Muslim country. I think the same in France. France is a secular country, and so the tolerance is a number of things are legitimately sort of legitimate for the Muslim community, but there's a limit that becomes sort of, at least for the general opinion, offensive to the secular nature of the republic. And of course, the Catholic Church has a much better, can show their, sign of religion because they were at least historically the dominant religion, and so they are advantaged, if you wish, even in the secular states, vis-a-vis the Islam. Another concept, which is different from tolerance or toleration, is respect. Respect, I think, is a is a more sort of modern, probably, notion in a multicultural society. I mean, communities have to respect each other. And so here I'm referring, for example, to the debate about the cartoons, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. So there was this debate after the killings. There was a debate whether those caricatures were actually okay or not okay. And in my view, when you have a multicultural society, you have to have respect. And so free speech, or even humoristic speech, has to be limited by respect for the other community. So I would sort of distinguish those two kinds of tolerance, on the one hand, which implies sort of a some power relationship in a strong and a weak, and respect, which is more egalitarian concept, where there has to be respect, reciprocal respect in the community. So I know this may sound very controversial, but this is how I approach the subject of listening to the discussion.
Well, it's I mean, the ban on the burqa or the niqab in the public sphere was imposed in I think 2010 in France, and that was a shocking decision because it seemed to challenge the norms of living together, as if we're trying to impose a living together. But this reasoning doesn't really operate today. I mean, the French state is a secular state, so it's not supposed to take side with religion or against that. It's supposed to be neutral. The key value is laïcité, secularism. And I can cite Ferdinand Buisson on this issue. A secular state, which is supposed to be the French state, maybe it's not truly secular, but it's supposed to be, is neutral with regard to all forms of worship, independent of all clergies, free of all theological views. And that implies, theoretically, a real deep separation between church and state, or between the temporal and the spiritual sphere. But that's the dream of the French system. The reality is different. We've had debate on whether we should allow the full facial veil in the street or just a small veil in the street. That has been the norm. Other debate having to do with the norms of living together. And the norm of living together is fluctuating, including in France, although there's great reluctance to accept veiled students or veiled faculty people, for instance, in the public sphere. So there's, but things are evolving, things are changing, I think, today. There's much more flexibility and openness to a variety of religion, including Islam. So, what is your point, Laurent, basically?
Well, I don't know if I have a particular point, but I guess my point was probably that we cannot move away too much from the traditional definition of toleration. In other words, whether you call it tolerance or toleration, that implies necessarily that somebody, whether it's the king or the law or whatever it is, granting some rights, some freedoms to a minority. And those limits are definitely fluctuating based on all kinds, not only history, but current events, current affairs. And so that was my first one. The other point was that I thought that another notion quite different from tolerance, and that was clearly in the Charlie debate, it was not really about tolerance. It's about whether it's okay to insult a religion even through caricature. And so, from my own experience, as a I feel like minorities, even if they are, granted freedom and right, have to somehow keep their place in the environment where they are. And conversely, that the dominant religion or social group, whatever, has to show respect for, the group that is not, in power, not the majority. That's all I was.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the notion of respect is deeply embedded in the kind of positive notion of tolerance that you present in the book. In other words, that the way that we think of kind of a more positive tolerance that is not simply ensuring that there aren't, direct harms, but actually fostering a space of greater equality, in a sense, is a form of respect. And so I think that it is kind of embedded in your notion of positive tolerance. But I've been trying to grapple with your idea that tolerance is always given by a power or a sovereign or the law, or by the more powerful, in a sense, to a minority or to person. And of course that is part of the that was part of the negative notion of tolerance that you describe in your book, and that the Washington quote that you read, Sherry, was actually a rejection.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
It was exactly a rejection of that idea that that somehow it's given to us, that tolerance is given to us or given to a minority, and that in fact, and in part through the question of respect, we go towards a more positive notion of tolerance. And I kind of see that in your book as a historical development, as a trajectory. Now, but the one question it raises, though, is, so if you get rid of the idea that tolerance is a question of the powerful or the king or the sovereign giving it away, right, to a minority, then what are we left with, and how should we think about tolerance? And so I was trying to think about it in the context of contemporary digital expression, which was something we were talking about earlier, and particularly kind of these questions right now, the controversy over Facebook, how it's dealing with political advertisements, allowing them all in the form of kind of free speech, free unregulated space versus Twitter that is not allowing political campaigns. And trying to think of it through this question of is this the powerful, in some sense, bestowing on minorities? And it doesn't seem as if that's what's going on, in part because what's so tricky about those very questions, of course, is that it costs a lot of money actually to be running these campaigns, these advertisements, these political advertisements, and they're not simply forms of speech. This is where things get complicated, right? Because we like to think it's just another question of free speech or not free speech, but actually these forms are themselves heavily regulated. They're regulated by algorithms that the GAFAs have put in place, so that certain advertisements will go more likely to certain people. Right? There are algorithms that decide how your news is fed to you. These are extremely expensive to place. These advertisements, they're, we're talking in the millions of dollars. I heard a report this morning about how much money was being spent on political advertising so far and how much the election in 2020 is going to cost. In terms of political advertising, the numbers were just staggering. Staggering. But also, there's also a lot more than just free speech with these advertisements because they're actually tracking us. So embedded in these advertisements are forms that you don't realize, but they track you. If you click on or if you watch, they'll track your IP address, and then so speech is going to be sent to you differently as a result of that. So what this suggests is it's much more complicated than simply talking about free speech versus not free speech, both in a national context as well, because there's a lot of regulated speech in America. Obscenity, for instance, is highly regulated in America, less so in France. So then the question becomes, how, which was your original question, how then do we regulate this, or towards what end? And I mean, you had suggested, and you had provocatively said, Sherry, there have to be rules here, right? Since this is
You teach at a law school.
teach in law school. And so what you learn in law school is that there aren't rules. Okay? If there were rules, you wouldn't need law schools and you wouldn't need lawyers. What there are is breaking rules and getting around rules and twisting rules and showing that rules aren't the real rules that we saw. That's how law works. So you wouldn't need Columbia Law School if there were rules. Would you?
Well, that's a very radical interpretation of what the rule of law means.
Okay, so let me give you a not so radical interpretation of that. Under the Obama administration, a very good jurist, who's a colleague of mine at Harvard, wrote a 41-page opinion saying that you can summarily execute an American abroad. That seems to defy, but you would think that the due process, like you can't deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, would simply exclude that. That's about as clear-cut a case of a
Okay, so I think
being violated.
we're getting off topic. I mean, I think there's a very interesting debate to be had about, interpretation of laws, right? So just because you have laws doesn't mean people don't interpret them differently. I take that to be your argument about why there's law school, right? Because you start with laws and then people debate how to implement them in particular cases. But that's not the same thing as saying we don't have laws at all. Presumably you don't want to live in Somalia. There's an advantage to having laws even if we don't actually all agree on how they're implemented.
There are laws in Somalia.
Okay, all right. We're gonna continue this conversation, but I want to make sure other people have the chances. This fellow had his hand up before, and I want to give him and others a chance to kind of intervene as well. No, the fellow, yes, the fellow in the orange, but you can obviously get your chance to.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting panel discussion so far. So I'm not sure myself where I stand on this, but just for debate's sake, I'd like to push back on the idea that tolerance isn't in some sense necessarily tied to historical patterns of oppression, because at least theoretically it seems conceivable that there's a group that has been historically oppressed, and at the same time they hold very terrible ideas that we would just fundamentally have to agree on that that's not a good thing, right? So it seems to entail that there's at least a notion of cultural relativism, right? In the sense that, if there's a different culture than mine, I cannot really comment on that, and I can particularly not comment on that if my ancestors did something bad to the ancestors of that other culture. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understood your question, but should we be tolerant of the intolerant? Is that what we are?
The question is whether, thank you. Whether the fact that if someone is intolerant, and however, you and I define that, right? The fact that them belonging to a group that has been historically oppressed makes a difference to how we answer the question of whether we're going to tolerate their intolerance. Right?
I think that's sort of trying to engage points that both of you make, right? Because presumably the second part of that is getting towards this idea that we should have different standards for groups depending on their historical disadvantage, right? So I understood you as sort of defending partially, Bernard, Bernard, that particular view, right? That tolerance should apply differently to groups depending on where they stand in the power relations of society. But then the question becomes, suppose those disadvantaged groups are themselves intolerant. How do those two things balance each other out? If that's what okay.
Right, yeah. So I wasn't so much suggesting that tolerance should be different, so much as trying to suggest that what we do when we regulate society, what we should be doing when we regulate society in this way, through what are effectively regulations of whether it's civility or whether it's regulations of tolerance, etc. What we should be doing, right, is trying to address historical legacies of oppression. In other words, that today we live in a time that is the product of a series of oppressive relations. It's the product of gender inequalities, racial inequalities, ethnic inequalities, and that those legacies continue. That we live with them, and women didn't have the right to contract until relatively recently in history, for instance, or women as in a married relationship were considered property until historically not that long ago. African Americans came to this country as slaves, as property, and all of that kind of like affects the world that we live in today. And what I would say is that our treatment of and our decisions about what to tolerate and what not to tolerate, or how to think about toleration, or what our discourse about toleration, about speech, etc., should be about, I would argue, that's my argument, is about redressing that, trying to create equalities, trying to create a more equal society, such that there may be times in which it would be necessary to regulate speech in a particular context, maybe in a Me Too context, or in Charlottesville context, where one should be attuned to that. So it can't be that you're simply using this kind of simplistic veil of, oh no, it's free speech everywhere. It's that we should be thinking about speech, and in the context also perhaps of the Chapier as well, and the satires as well, etc. That we should be thinking about, well, what have been the historical relations here? What has been in France, we would pay more attention to colonization, right? And then we would try and figure out, well, okay, so let's try and figure this out. And maybe actually the wearing of the veil, we would want to think about, not simply in terms of laïcité and secular values, etc., but we might want to think, well, what about the history of colonization? What about French history of colonization, right? And how does the moment that we're living in today and the enforcement of particular rules, such as you can't wear a veil in the street or something, how does that relate to the history of colonization that brought us to this point, and to the inequalities that are the product of those various histories? That's what I meant. That's what I meant positively, right?
Should we take more questions?
Yes, why don't we take a couple, okay, so I saw this young lady here and this gentleman here, so why don't we take two and then we'll do two at a time, okay? We'll,
This is, first of all, thank you guys, because this has been great. This is called Should We Tolerate the Intolerant? And based on that title, one of the most intriguing things about the event was I thought, I'd love to ask you guys, do you think that you are tolerant? And what are the qualifications you would put around why you are or aren't?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. Actually, I think the question of should we tolerate the intolerant, I think what I've been hearing so far in this discussion are two levels: the level of attitudes of people, ordinary people, different communities coming into interaction with each other, but also the level of the legislative level and the institutional level. And if you can talk a bit about how these speak to each other, but also a question that I kept thinking about is not just how should we tolerate the intolerant, but also how our ideas about who is intolerant is constructed and is historically contingent upon historical conditions and political conditions. Like in France, for example, who is being intolerant? The person who's wearing the veil, or the burqa, or the state that is not allowing them to wear the burqa. So I think if you can talk a bit about the construction of intolerance itself in this particular age. So for example, I work in Tunisia, and a big debate, which is a fully Muslim, almost all Muslims, and there's a huge debate in every Ramadan when everyone should be fasting. There's a huge debate about people who don't want to fast and want to have the right to drink water or eat on the street when everyone else is fasting. So who's being, who's the intolerant here? Is it the people who want to drink water? Are they being intolerant towards the majority of people who are fasting? Or under this regime, should they be allowed to drink water in this fully Muslim, majority Muslim society? So this is really fascinating. And just a question on the tolerance in France. The question you asked that it has to do with the history of the French church in Catholic Church in France. I was wondering to what extent that it also is tied to the colonial legacy of France and its administration of its protectorates and settler colonialism in Algeria and Morocco and protectorate in Tunisia and Morocco. Thank you.
Well, yeah, there are so many questions, kind of difficult, and probably I will not answer all of them, but what do we tolerate today? It depends at which historical time you position yourself. French society is much more tolerant today than it was 10 years or 20 years ago, but the French society no longer is, or France no longer is a colonial power, so that makes, of course, a big difference. And there are many forms of tolerance and intolerance. Even though society is evolving, and if you look at the laws on blasphemy or prohibiting this and that political discourse, things are evolving very fast. And I think today we're a much more tolerant society than we were at the time when we ran colonies, of course. But it's still a debate that continues. Debate about the Islamic veil or not, debate about what place should we give to Muslims in a French society, how to treat the former French colonies. So it's an ongoing debate, and yet I think the society is evolving toward more and more tolerance of religious bars. I mean, if you walk in the streets in Paris, you have veiled women that are not veiled, people that have big golden cross attached to their neck, others who don't. I mean, the society is incredibly varied, and religion doesn't seem to be central today the way it used to be. Is that a sign of tolerance? Could be. It could be also a sign of rejection or amendment of references to religion. Atheism is also an important value in the French society. So it's difficult to answer your question, but I think there's an increase of tolerance because there are so many different populations in the French schools. So by necessity, we have become more tolerant. The weight of religion, whether established the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, other churches, is much less today than it used to be. And de facto, we're become tolerant because religion is less important in the French society today.
Okay, so yeah, no, this is a great question. So who are the intolerant? And am I intolerant? I'll start with you. So I think that although they're obviously the two are next. Or embedded in each other. Okay, so what is art? So I'm re-emphasizing that something that I liked about the book was this self-reflection, this ability to kind of look on one's own culture and ask the questions of tolerance and intolerance. I think that's really important, not just to do the comparisons, but to reflect, and you do a lot of reflecting on the situation in France. As I reflect on the situation in the United States, I look upon, for instance, the Muslim ban that is passed in this country, that was signed as an executive order, 2 days after President Trump became president, as one of the most egregious violations of tolerance and all of the rhetoric that surrounded the Muslim ban, which is
The Muslim ban,
the ban on persons from Muslim countries coming into the United States. The fact that you can't get a visa, basically, all of the language that preceded the signing of the ban was some of the most vile and intolerant language I've ever heard in American discourse recently. I mean, or at least at that point, maybe 2016 or something. So the language you use, I'm saying, we've got a real problem with Muslims coming into this country. That's a quote, right? Now, I mean, if you had put any other religion in there, like Jews or I don't know, anything else, I think this country would have reacted more than it did. I think that the population would have reacted more. If you take all of those quotes, and I had to kind of string cite them because I sued Trump 2 days after he was elected, and I had to make a string cite of how this was religious, this was an establishment of religion, effectively. And you put Jew instead of Muslim in those statements, I mean, I think people would have, but I think even though America is relatively anti-Semitic also, but I think people would have just reacted differently than they did. So when I think of kind of like examples of intolerance, I think of that. And so often kind of for me, who is intolerant? I mean, I focus more on my home, wherever I'm living at the time, to try to figure out who's being intolerant. Yeah. But in response to that tricky question, I have to say that I'm very intolerant myself. I'm very intolerant of things that are intolerable. And what does that mean? I mean, that does mean, in fact, that I'm very conscious. That this isn't a question of just tolerating, or being tolerant. That this is a question of regulating society the way I think it needs to be regulated. So it's not a mistake that the last book was called The Counter-Revolution. I mean, I do believe that we are facing a counter-revolution. I do believe that when you listen to the rhetoric of, for instance, President Donald Trump, there's an intolerance that is widespread. Right? And I'm not tolerant of that. So I'm prepared to try to regulate our society in a way that is not going to be tolerant in order to try and push it in a particular direction.
Yeah, there's a motivator. One should not be tolerant of the enemies of tolerance.
Okay, we had some questions over here, this gentleman, and another fellow over there. Oh, okay, there's two. All right, so go ahead. Let's take 3 questions then, since my finger was pointing in that direction. Go ahead.
Well, thanks so much. I want to follow up on the question of who's intolerant or who are intolerant. I'm wondering specifically if you can speak to the question of who judges intolerance. If I say something with positive intent and the base language doesn't have intolerance in it, but you judge it as being intolerant, does that constitute intolerance? And if that difference at all affects how we treat intolerance.
I think was there somebody else behind him, or?
In terms of defining and then kind of enforcing and controlling tolerance and intolerance, how would you divide that responsibility between civil society and the government?
Could you just say that, could you just explain that a little bit more, just the relationship between civil society
and the government? Like, who would you say, how would you delegate responsibility of defining what intolerance and tolerance are, and then deciding how they should be enforced?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, this is for lively conversation. So I think the main question still hasn't been answered to my satisfaction. That sort of where do you draw the line? If you can explain clearly, especially me, I still don't quite understand your view on this yet. What kind of intolerance is intolerable, in your opinion, in a liberal society? And following on that question, how does a liberal representative regime justify that intolerance to the intolerant thought or behavior? And of course, a potential action, as you cited in Washington, would be, it is a natural right of those who constitute such a political body to be tolerated. I think this is a good answer, it's a satisfactory answer. However, right, of course, is something that's always shaped by dialogue. And very often we see these invocations of the concept of human right just in order to shut down conversation. I think the internet is a human right. Therefore, we don't need to have any more conversation about what to prioritize in our aid to this country. We need to pave the internet facilities. How do we sort of walk the line between in which we are sort of upholding the rights of every individual to be tolerated, but also allowing the conversation about what these rights are to happen organically, especially a conversation about how much tolerance are you guaranteed by virtue of your natural right? Thank you.
By virtue of?
Your natural right.
So, in what you were saying, there was drawn a line between tolerance, if I understood well, and rights, or were you opposing tolerance and rights, putting that at the same level?
Sorry, but Mike, so that question was sort of how do you justify intolerance of the intolerant people? And I think the potential answer is that, well, we shouldn't tolerate, let's say the whole of America wants to unjustly kill my friend over here. But we're not going to let that happen even if everyone wants it, even though it's a representative regime, because
Unless it's a criminal.
yes, well, yes, he's innocent, but we want to protect his right, and you can say that it is his, but also his right to be tolerated. Therefore, we cannot justify any intolerant behavior, even in a representative regime. However, the sort of how much tolerance he deserves just by natural right is also up for debate. And how do we let that debate continue and therefore sort of in a way that this regime is still representative, it's still representational. And I think about cases of, for example, religious conservatives in the United States. The conversation about how much right tolerance do members of the certain, for example, the LGBT community. That's a very sort of debated question in American politics. Something we.
So we're almost at the end.
I'm sorry.
So no, it's totally fine. So let me give you guys both a chance to respond to the questions that we just had.
Well, again, I'm not sure I fully understood your question. I mean, you were saying religious conservative, so again,
Maybe I'll simplify my question. So, how do you justify any intolerance, even of the intolerant, in a liberal representation regime?
well, if the intolerant want to destroy the liberal regime, I mean, you cannot tolerate people whose aim is the destruction of the regime, of the tolerant regime. So that cannot be, I mean, there are limits to tolerance. And limits to tolerance, in that you cannot tolerate those who will destroy tolerance. I think that's a kind of clear limits, but it's rare in real life circumstances. It doesn't really happen that way. It's more complicated, and you would really have someone who's, to say, I'm so tolerant that I'm going to destroy the society as it exists. Here, it's much more complicated than that. And there are nuances. I mean, there are groups that are more or less tolerant of this, but not of that. So you have to be very much aware of those nuances that exist in society. I think it's important to but should we tolerate the intolerant? No, I mean, of course not. We should not tolerate the intolerant. If the intolerant want to destroy existing regime of tolerance, however, there may be circumstances where you want to be intolerant of injustice, intolerant of some form of violence that are unacceptable. So it's not always about tolerance. There are circumstances where one has to be very firm and perhaps even intolerant. And you have to think of the two cases.
Yeah, so I think, I think I agree with that, the last formulation. And in a sense, when I was responding earlier to the question about whether I was tolerant or not, right, I very explicitly said I was intolerant of the intolerable, rather than the intolerant. And I heard that in your last expression as well. What does that mean? Being intolerant of the intolerable is of conditions, social conditions that are unacceptable. Who then judges? Who then defines, right? And where do we draw the line? I would say that this is an exercise of. I would say it is an exercise for civil society. For us to not be tolerant towards intolerable conditions of exploitation, of inequality, etc. It would be nice if government came along and helped us on that task, but I'm not overly sanguine that they will. Things are complicated with government. So I think it's our responsibility. And I don't know if I would call it civil society, I'd say us, us in this room, it's our task to not be tolerant towards the intolerable conditions. And I would draw the line on specifically intolerable conditions. And what would that be? I think that those conditions would be related to inequalities today. That have become, I would sense, kind of gross and unacceptable.
Okay, well, clearly there is a lot more that could be said on these questions, but thank you both for coming and talking about these difficult and important topics, and thank you for this wonderful book. And thank you all for coming as well.